Japan is great because it has childcare leave that even men are entitled to take 1 year off. Most men take in Japan, as far as I know, it's like 1 week or 2 weeks. While I was working on that just for fun, I realized, hey, this is something that I really want to do full time. It seems crazy, and I think it was really crazy too, even thinking back. But instead of sleeping, I started coding at night.
Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and sitting here today with Christoph. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Christoph, you're the founder of Nakazawa Tech. It's a tech company based in Tokyo, where you also produce games, and you work mostly with open source technology, which is super interesting. And first time we're going to talk about this in the context of Japan on the show. But before we get into all of this, maybe can you introduce yourself and tell us how you got to Japan?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting story, and it's a very personal reason. So I'm from Austria, but I worked in the US, in California for a few years. I worked in the UK, in London for a few years, and my wife is from Japan. And at the time, that was when COVID just started. We had a daughter, and she was like 2 years old at the time, and everything kind of just became really tough, right? It's hard to remember now. It's like been 4 years. It's almost exactly 4 years since all that started, and now everybody kind of forgot about it. But like back then, it was like just incredibly tough on like us as a family being kind of stuck in a small like flat in London, and then so we just decided, hey, we think this is going to take a long time to play out. And so a few months into the pandemic starting, we decided to move to Japan, and so my wife and I both quit our jobs, moved to Japan, got new jobs. We found a new school for our daughter, a nursery. And so that's kind of how I ended up in Japan. So it was a purely personal kind of decision that we thought maybe it makes sense to spend a few years or maybe longer in Japan.
Yeah, I think that was kind of interesting timing for a lot of people, right? Before Japan maybe started closing the borders, and just a lot of people didn't know what to do at that time. Should we move somewhere? Should we get closer to family? Because nobody knew that we would be locked into certain spaces for a while.
Exactly, yeah, and it's crazy to talk about this now 4 years later, right? Where it's like you go back in time. I don't want to like spend all of the time talking about like this past, but it's this time where kind of everyone like lost their mind for a short little while, right? And it like took so long to kind of get back to this like normal life. And yeah, for us, like in that time, it just made making like one major decision to spend time in Japan instead of staying in the UK.
So that decision was kind of, let's be closer to family and be together as a family. But did you have a plan for when you came to Japan? You said you quit your jobs. So I assume you were, doing career at a company, a tech company in London. And did you have a plan for when moving to Japan, or was it like, we're going to figure it out once we arrive?
Yeah, it wasn't super well planned. So at that point in time, we kind of just prioritized our own well-being and our family. So just for context, at that point in time, I had been at Facebook for almost 10 years. So I was an intern at Facebook, then a contractor, then I finished my university degree, and then I spent like 8 years or so full-time. And so I had already been talking to my wife, like, hey, I'm coming up on this like kind of big 10 years of like spending all my spending 10 years of my career at like one company, like, am I going to continue on this path and stay at this company, or am I going to go and do something else to like, see other things, see other companies, or like make other experiences, right? So we had this conversation on and off. It wasn't like a very serious conversation, but it was more like, hey, is there something else that I should be doing? And so we had been talking about that for quite a long time. So it was more like, hey, we're making a decision here, given like this crisis in the world, and what happens with the job is not that important. And I thought, I'll always be able to find something to do. There's like so much that you can do, and like it was just like not that big of a deal. Obviously it's tough to go and like, quit a job, find a new one. Like it's a lot of work, it's exhausting. But I wasn't really too worried about that,
And once you got to Japan, eventually you started your own company.
Yeah.
What was the decision making there? Did you try to have a career in Japan and then realized, I'm going to do my own thing, actually? This is the time to try.
Yeah, and so this is the like really interesting thing looking back on it, right? It's so hard to make these decisions to like quit a job or something like that, or make major life decisions. But then looking back at it, it's like, wow, I made maybe some good decisions, some bad decisions, but I'm so glad I made all of these and experiences, because that's what led me to doing what I'm doing now, right? And so after we came to Japan, I still spent a bit of time at Facebook, but then I ended up joining Stripe, which is a payments company, so a fintech company. And I really enjoyed my time there for like the first year, but then we had another kid. And so I decided, hey, I've been working now for like full time for this entire time, even though, I switched jobs, but there was like no time in between really. Maybe it makes sense to take time off to be with the kids. And I think this is something where, maybe some families, they're really good at coping and they're like, oh, anytime you add a child, it gets easier. But like, I don't know, nobody tells you how much actually gets harder, right? Like if you have one child, you hand it to like a school or like two grandparents or something like that. And then you're like, okay, now we can do something else. But once you have two kids, you hand one kid to childcare, but you still have the other kid to look after, right? And so everything just increases so much in complexity, like all the scheduling, just you're two parents and you have two children and like you have to bring one child there, one child here. So it's just really, really tough and really exhausting. And I don't want to complain. Like I think having children is like a really amazing and unique experience, but at the same time, it's just really, really tough every single day, right? Especially when they're small. And so I decided, hey, I'm going to take the whole year off. And Japan is great because it has childcare leave that even men are entitled to take 1 year off. It's really sad that barely anyone takes that opportunity. Like the most men take in Japan, as far as I know, it's like 1 week or 2 weeks, and like very few people go and like take a whole year. Of course, there's like a difference where you get a reduced salary for that period of time. So we were fortunate to have savings, so it wasn't like that big of a deal from the financial perspective. But it was just something where I thought, I just want to be there with my family for a year. And like, it was just incredibly tough. And so this is what then led me to thinking about starting a company. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to take a year off and build my company. That was not the case at all. I thought I'm going to take a year off to be with my family. And then I realized, wow, it's like extremely hard to look after two children, and like my wife was doing so much work to look after both of them. I was doing so much work to look after both of them. It's very hard to like even just relax, like you wake up, you take care of the kids, and then by the end of the day, when they are in bed, you're like, I'm done. I need to go to bed. Like it's like sometimes even hard to like watch a movie or something, because it's like, oh, this is like 2 hours. I'm not gonna stay up that long.
It's an
right?
extra full-time job.
Yeah. It's like it's incredibly hard. And so what happened for me is that I started coding more than 20 years ago because I wanted to build video games. Because as a teenager, I was like, playing video games like many people do. And I had kind of lost that passion. I haven't lost the passion, but I just didn't have time to work on video games again. And so I thought it was really hard to look after the kids. And so instead of sleeping, I started coding at night. And so I just thought, okay, there's this game I built. There's this game I used to love playing. And I want to build like a similar game to what I used to do when I was just a teenager in high school. And just at the end of school day, I would just go home and like write some code. And so instead of sleeping, after looking after the kids, I just went to my computer and, normally I would have like 6 to 8 hours of sleep. And then that changed to, maybe I'll code for 2 hours or 4 hours. And then my sleep schedule was kind of like maybe messed up, but I only got like 4 to 6 hours of sleep after that. But I felt so much better every day. So I really found that going back to this mindset of like not coding at a company to, as like thinking of it as a career and like building something at a large company, just taking it back to this pure thing of, I just want to create something and I just need this to relax. It's kind of like meditation. And so that's how I started working on this video game, Athena Crisis. And that's what I'm working on right now still. So I started on it about 2 years ago. And it was just really what helped me get through that time. And then while I was working on that, just for fun, I realized, hey, this is something that I really want to do full time. And like, it seems crazy. And I think it was really crazy too, even thinking back. But I thought, I just want to go back to this where I'm building something and I'm creating something from scratch without having to go to meetings all the time, without having to negotiate or argue with people, or without having to do performance reviews. So I had been an engineering manager for like 6 years before that. And it's just really draining. And so I thought, I just need to do something different. And so all of this kind of just happened. There was no grand plan to it. It's just, I started coding, started building something. And then at some point I was like, hey, I feel like I've got something here. And then I started a company around it.
So We're going to talk about Athena Crisis a little bit later, but I'm curious about once you decide, oh, I actually really enjoyed coding, I want to turn this into a business. As a business, well, you need to establish it, you need to register it, but you also need to drive revenue, right? Because you need to take care of your family if you're going to leave working at Stripe behind. What was the process to establish and get the company going and make it something that you can actually do full time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's like multiple aspects to it, right? One, especially because we're in Japan, incorporating a company. This is something where I feel like that's just such a great experience where, you know, there's all these things you can only kind of do like once in your life, you know, like having kids, like you have to have a kid to understand what that is, right? Like working at a company, you have to be an employee to understand what it's like to be an employee. And that's a very common experience that most people make. Very few people make that experience of starting a company, right? That's like always a very abstract kind of concept. And, you know, companies are also this like kind of abstract thing. You know, they're not something physical, right? That you can like, you know, grab or something. But like, it's just an absolutely interesting experience. And I think for me, I thought it was like funny. I wasn't upset that it takes so long because I think that's very similar. I'm from Austria, and so it's very similar there. Also in Germany, it takes like weeks to get a bank account. It takes weeks to like incorporate a company. It's very different from the US where you like go on a website like Stripe, for example, has Stripe Atlas where you can click a few buttons and it will incorporate a company for you and give you a bank account within like an hour. And
That's
then
super
you have
fast.
like, you actually have your company set up, right? And it's like this artificial thing that just like you click a button on the internet. That's, as a person in tech, that makes so much sense to me. So going away from like, you know, I had lived in the US before. I have never incorporated a company there, but then coming here and then you have to get like your registered hanko, like the stamp. And then we had this like really funny coincidence where when my wife and I got married, I took her name. So we got married in Austria and I changed my name, my legal name. And so I got a really nice hanko from my mother-in-law that had Nakazawa using the kanji on the hanko. And so I had been using that stamp for like, you know, different things in Japan since we had moved here. And then I realized I had to register it. That's something I never did before. So you have to go to the ward office and then you show them your stamp, you like, you know, make a few samples, and then you get a stamp registration card so that and also a stamp certificate that says that this stamp belongs to you. And the next time you need that certificate again, instead of bringing the stamp, you bring the card. Yeah, which is, it's all really like funny to experience that. But then the funniest thing to me was like I brought that stamp and they were like saying, well, your name is Nakazawa and the stamp says Nakazawa, but they're obviously not the same. Because one of them was using kanji, but my name is written Nakazawa in Romaji, or in, you know, regular alphabet. And so we had to like, my wife and I, we like looked at Google Maps and we're like, okay, who can, you know, make a new hanko like really fast? Like, and then within an hour or so, we went to that shop, got a new hanko, went back to the ward office, registered that stamp. And so that is all like, incorporating a company is just this like really fun process. It's a bit exhausting, but it's something you have to do. And then you're like, you get all these documents and it's like, okay, now I have a company. And it's nothing is different about your life than before, but like you have a company. And the thing that really matters after that is the meaning that you give to that company, right?
So you had that paper and you, like you said, something changes a little bit. You suddenly own an intangible entity called a company.
Yeah.
And you have to do something with it, right? So how did your feelings change suddenly, where this project that you had been coding on for fun and that you started to really enjoy was transposed into this intangible asset that you were now holding on paper, and you were like, okay, now I have to do something even more with this?
Yeah, no, this is a fantastic question, because this is, everything there happened at the same time. I knew I was going to quit my job. And then obviously you also need to be employed somewhere that you have health insurance, or, you know, it's not necessary, but you don't want to be unemployed. You know, all this kind of stuff you want to just have figured out, right? So having a company to, you know, take care of like your annual health check, you know, like that sort of stuff that you have to do in Japan, like it all makes sense, right? But then at the same time also, I found a publisher for the video game through a mutual friend. So Athena Crisis being published by a new games publisher called Null Games.
Okay.
And they're really awesome to work with. So all of that stuff happened together, and then, you know, we were going to sign an agreement, but I didn't have a company, and then it takes so many weeks in Japan to sign the company, and then banks were failing in the US, and like, you know, where my publisher is based, and that was all like 1 year ago, and it was like all madness like in that period of time.
Oh, that's when all the companies the game companies were laying off people.
There were like layoffs in the tech world. Like everything was kind of like really crazy in that time. And so for me, the thing that really changed from like before, where I'm like, hey, I'm just doing this kind of like cope with like life and what things are going on around me, was, oh, this is like a real thing, right? Like it's so weird because you said it's intangible. It's like you just get a piece of paper that says, here's a company name and like a stamp and like a number, and that's yours, right? But then everything changed in terms of, okay, now I have to give meaning to this company, and I'm changing from like building this game for fun as like a recreational thing to, hey, I'm actually going to publish this game on like all the platforms, like, on iPhone, on Steam, which is like a games platform. And I'm going to turn this into something serious, and like I had to change from this, like, I'm doing this for fun, to be much more pragmatic of like, how do I actually ship this to people now? And so everything, like, in some sense, nothing changes, but in the other, like, everything really changed because I thought, okay, now this is real.
How does it work on the financial side? So you established the company and you said you have a publisher, you found a publisher, but that publisher is based in the United States. Is there any specific, are there any specific requirements when you live in Japan and have your company incorporated here and are creating a game that is being published by an outside of Japan publisher?
No, that's not related. No, the big benefit of having a publisher is that they can help you with marketing, they can help you with PR, they can help you with localization, like all these sort of things. It's the idea also for Null Games is that they help you ship a game, but they don't try to influence what game it is, right? Obviously, they'll only sign games that they like, that they want to publish, but they don't try to influence, like, tell you, hey, here's like what game you need to build, right? So in that sense, it's a really great partnership. And like, to me, then the secondary aspect from like changing from, this recreational hobby thing to turning it into like, an actual product and like being more pragmatic about it. The other thing is just this freedom that came with it. And that's why I was saying it's such an interesting experience to start a company where, and like, I don't want to say this in like a negative way, like, when it's just a different experience, right? When you're like at a large company or like, at any company as an employee, you're there to kind of build something that you didn't start, most likely, right? You ended up there somehow, and you're building something that is like part of that company's product, or whatever that company is building. You're just being added to that, and then you're gonna make that better, and maybe you have more impact, or maybe you have less impact. Maybe you have the ability to build whatever you want. At Facebook, for example, I had a really fantastic role, or different roles, where I was able to build something and open source it so anybody in the world can use it, right? And like, there's millions of developers actually using stuff that I was able to build. So that was a really great setup. I think that's very rare. And quite often you can find yourself in a space where you feel really constrained. So, you go into an office, or, you work remotely, you work with like 5 different people on one project. You don't really care about it. You might care about it, you might not, but you're always in like this kind of constrained environment, right? And starting a company and then having a great partner, like with Null Games, it just felt like there's so much freedom, Nobody tells you when to show up, like it doesn't matter. But then the downside is, nobody's going to tell you that you need to get stuff done, right? So you have to be really focused, really strict. And I think that's the really interesting experience about starting a company. It's like figuring out how to do all these things. None of these are magical. None of these are like particularly hard. They're quite exhausting, and like, if you don't know, it's like often hard to figure out what you don't know, right? But like, it's not that hard. You just have to go through these processes. And then again, you have to just really focus and be pragmatic about like, hey, I actually need to build something. But there's a lot of freedom in it. So all of this is like trade-offs. And so I think it's great to start a company to get that experience. And I think there's a lot of people that would really benefit from it. And I think the world would also be better off, because there's a lot of people with great ideas stuck in an environment where those ideas are maybe not appreciated, right? And I think it's also possible for many people to start a company and then realize, hey, actually, I learned a lot, and this is not for me. And the reason why I think that is, this is something I learned in tech, is when you only have one role, your perspective is so limited. Right? So let's say you're an engineer at a tech company like Facebook, right? And it's great, it's amazing. It was like one of the best time in my life. But you just have this role of like, I show up and I'm working on this product and I'm writing code. And then I switched to engineering management, and I was like, holy shit, it feels like you get plugged into the matrix, and like there's this entire information layer above all the engineers that you had no access to before. And then suddenly you get a completely different perspective of the world, or like that organization, and like how it works, how the product works, what you're doing, why you're doing things, who you need to talk to, who your customers are, it's just crazy. It's like insane, and you learn so much. And then in between, I kind of often hopped between being a manager, and then briefly I went back to engineering, and then realized, no, actually I prefer being a manager. But it feels like you go back to engineering when you've been a manager before, and you gain superpowers, because you're like, suddenly you know something that all the other people that have never made that experience don't.
You understand why some decisions are made and why some processes are implemented.
And you become so much more effective, because you can go in and it's like, you don't just think, oh, my manager is asking me to do this, I don't like it, and I'm just gonna do, whatever. You come in, it's like, oh, I know exactly why we need to do the thing, and then so every conversation you have with everyone around you changes. And I think the exact same is true when you start a company. Like everything just changes about what you value, what you focus on, and the problems that you're running into.
One of the things you said that was quite interesting was that one of the things that you were proud of doing at Facebook was working on this open source code that now a lot of people are able to use. And that at the same time, you didn't like the constriction of, being narrowed down into you go and you do your code. And that now with your own company and working with Null Games, you have this freedom. And open source code is also at the core of your company. Can you explain a little bit for someone who's not familiar, what is open source code, and maybe expand on why is it so important for you?
Yeah, for sure. Just going back, I don't mean to say that what I did at Facebook was necessarily constraining. It's just throughout my entire career, there were times where I felt more constrained and times where I felt like maybe less constrained. And that setup that I had for most of my time at Facebook was usually pretty amazing. But yeah, so open source, for those of you that have never worked in tech or are not familiar with tech, open source is when you take code. So code is kind of what like runs the world nowadays, right? Like, so you open up your iPhone, you see a notification, you tap it, that talks to a server, and then that gives you some information. Or you like open Instagram, you see a video, it's like streamed from a server, and all that runs on code. So people just write silly texts into the computer, and then save it, and then put it somewhere on a server or on your phone, and then it does something, right? It feels a bit magical, right? And then normally all this code is written at some company, and they keep it to themselves, and they think, okay, this is our intellectual property. If somebody else gets this, they'll build a much better app than we do, and then we go out of business. And open source is the idea is that you write code and you just give it away for free, and anyone can use it to build whatever they want. And also you can use whatever anyone else is building and take that to build your own thing. And so for me, this journey started when I was a teenager as well. And so I think I just got this conviction really early on in my life that this is really important. And so one of the major things there that So one thing was like, I grew up in the countryside in Austria. And so access to information was like, it was only like about 22 years ago, but access to information, like, how do you program something? That just didn't exist. I couldn't go to the library and be like, here, give me a few books about how to program, right? All that information was on the internet for free. And back then you could go on a website and click, do a right click, and then it says there's this magical button saying view source. So you could basically see anything that anyone put on a website. Like nowadays it's like all hidden and masked and like compiled, so it's like very hard to see. But back then you could just go and see whatever anyone else built and like copy it and like make your own thing. And I found that fascinating. And then I came across Linux, which is like an operating system like iOS or Windows or Mac OS. And the guy who created it, he's a pretty controversial figure. And he's like rude on the internet quite often, maybe just a very angry man, like whatever. I don't appreciate that part about him. But he wrote this book where he just outlined his values about giving code away for free. And I thought that was just so powerful, because, you write all this code and you like put it somewhere, you sell it or whatever. And then maybe you reach like 100 companies and, maybe, yes, it's more lucrative, you can make a lot of money off it, but you give it away for free and like, the entire world might use that code, right? And so that was fascinating. So even as a teenager, I got into open source projects. So I contributed to them. There's like certain websites where you go and then all these projects are there and you can make friends. I made a lot of friends. And that's also how I eventually ended up at Facebook, working on open source technologies.
Yeah, interesting.
And so it's always been a part of me of my life and my career. So I thought that if I'm building a company, I want to be as open as possible.
I'm quite curious now if you put this into a Japanese context. Is open source as well something quite prevalent in Japan when you talk maybe with other developers in Tokyo or across Japan, that you see they're using open source? Are they interested in this, or is this kind of Japan is a bit away from this and they do their own code?
Yeah, no, totally. It's I think it's a global thing, and also in Japan, like there's a bunch of meetups all over Japan, and then especially in Tokyo, I guess, and they're all around these open source technologies. They're like various conferences, and then monthly meetups or something like that. I think it's fair to say that basically any company that has any sort of code running, which is like pretty much most companies nowadays, except smaller ones that might only have a website, right? But like even if you're just like a hair salon and you have a website, that's running on open source technology. If you pull out your phone and you have an Android phone, that is that operating system that this guy Linus Torvalds built 30 years ago.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, exactly. So he gave it away for free. And like he was unhappy with the professor he was working, he was being taught by at university, and he just thought he has better ideas about how to build an operating system. So he just built it and gave it away for free to everyone. And then 30 years later, like almost every operating system is using that. Almost every hardware device is using that operating system or ideas from that operating system.
That's quite a way to prove a point.
Yes, exactly. And that's just so powerful because you give it away for free and anyone can use it. And it also, in my opinion, it has this huge impact on human progress. Because if every company keeps these things to themselves and a secret, it's very hard to, everybody has to recreate them, right? And yes, these developments might happen in parallel at different companies, but if everyone just contributes, you'll be, I think the rate of progress just keeps increasing. So I think in general, it's like good for humanity.
So that's one interesting thing too. Code is a language, right? Mm-hmm. And this language is used across the globe.
Yeah.
So JavaScript is JavaScript wherever you are. But then when communicating with others and working on developing projects, you also use regular language. Mm-hmm. And in Japan, many founders of companies and people working in different environments struggle with this language barrier. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that maybe in the tech world, where you have this common language of code, this language barrier gets broken down and people kind of understand, this is a...
Definitely did for me. I mean, for me, that's how I got really good at English, because I met all these people as a teenager that were living all over Europe and the US. So I made friends from Italy, friends from Spain, friends from Switzerland, from the UK, the US, and the common language was English, right? And so my English wasn't that good back then, but I was able to learn, right? And like that community that I was in, that was like an open source project in the JavaScript space, and JavaScript is what's basically used for all the websites in the world nowadays. And that community accepted me and I made friends and I still talk regularly to some of those people, right? If we think about Japan, the interesting thing that I've observed, so yes, in a way, it does break down barriers. I think it also helps a lot of engineers in Japan get a bit of exposure to English, right? And like that's a good way to kind of be more integrated in this global community of open source software. But the thing that frustrates me a little bit that I don't know how to solve, and I don't think anyone is really thinking about this on how to solve it, but I wish it could be solved, is what I experienced in Tokyo is that there are two tech communities. There's this international tech community of like folks that are primarily not from Japan, or they're like folks that are from Japan but lived abroad for a while, and so they speak really good English. And then there's also this very Japanese tech community, and then they'll have events that are all like only in Japanese. And it's my impression that those two communities are like completely separate and they're not getting together. There's very few events where like these two communities meet. And I think Japan is worse off because of that. I think it would be much better if there was a way to bring those two communities together. And I think that would improve like the tech community or tech companies in Japan.
Is this a language that's keeping those communities separated, or is this maybe because of different cultural backgrounds or perspectives on coding that there's a different interest in like this kind of foreign-based community is interested into coding things one way and the maybe more Japan-based community is having a different approach and different philosophy of course?
I don't know yet. That's the thing. Like I tried to figure that out. I went to a conference about 4 months ago, and they had like a few different tracks. So they had like the main track, and then a side track, and then yet another track. And so that third track was Japanese only. And the first one was like all the talks were in English, and it was kind of like the international track. And I just noticed that like almost everyone went to that Japanese track. So I think it was this conference that was primarily for folks that speak Japanese. And then all these folks maybe didn't understand English well enough, so that the main track was completely deserted. Like it was empty. There were 100 chairs or 150 chairs, and there was only like 10 people in the room.
Oh no.
Yeah, it was like, okay, this is awkward, right? And everybody went to that like really tiny room, cramped. They didn't even have like a projector. They just had like a tiny little screen on a table in the front, and everybody had to squint. And I just cannot make sense of it yet. I wish I could answer your question, because that might help solve that problem, but I wish I knew. And so I'm not entirely sure. It might be all of those things.
Now I'm very curious about your own project that you're working on. So you've set up the company a couple of years ago, and you have a partnership.
1 year ago.
One year ago, but you have a partnership already. So the game is making progress.
Mm-hmm.
And you have your core values, especially open source at the center. What is the reaction like when you share your project and you talk about what you're doing in those communities?
So the thing is that when you set up a company, or at least that's how I believe it makes sense, is I already said earlier, you have to give it a meaning, right? And so with that, you have to give it aspirational goals, like or like a North Star of like, this is what I want the company to be, or this is where I want to go in like a certain period of time. And so because open source has always been such a large part of my career, but also because, I not just because of that, but I also just genuinely appreciate all these projects out there that I can use to build whatever I want to build, right? Doesn't matter if I was part of it or not. And so I thought, okay, this has to be a core value that like I open source whatever I can. And so at this time, the game itself is not open source, but like there's libraries around it to, like for using the gamepad. So the thing is that I'm also building this game completely differently from all the other games that are out there. So normally there's something called a game engine. And so there's a few popular ones that people might have heard about. The two most popular ones are called Unity and Unreal. There's a lot of stuff in the press about the Unreal Engine now, with like conflict with Apple and all that, if people are following tech. But normally you take an engine and like it shows you this like 3D editing space, and then you write some code in there, and like everything is figured out for you. And the approach that I took for Athena Crisis is that because it was this kind of fun project, I wanted to learn, and like trying to get into the games industry, I was trying to just learn every aspect of building a game from scratch. Because when you use like a game engine, it's kind of like an abstraction where you sit on top, and then you're like, okay, I only need to figure out what these things on top do, but I don't really understand this system or that system, or how to like push it to this like Steam store, to like the App Store. And I was like, I don't want any of this. I want to start from scratch, because I want to understand all of these pieces, which is definitely a slower way to get started. But now that I built this entire system, I'm moving probably faster than most other, at least indie devs that are like developing on their own. And so just bringing that all together, I built all this set of technologies that I want to open source now. And so it's actually like a really good time to talk to you and like mention this, because I set out a year ago that I'm going to run an open source company. And we have open sourced a bunch of things, but right now the core thing that I spent the past 2 years building is not open source. And so right now I'm working on changing that. And so the game just shipped to what's called early access. So you can already play the current version of the game. But what I want to do is open source about 80% of the game's logic, like all of the code, basically, almost all of the code. So people can actually go in and like improve it, take it, build their own game in a similar style or whatever. And so that's like the next step. And the way that I look at this is I want to, the system that, or the phrase that people use for this is called open core. Okay. So open source is like you just give your code away, right? And open core is a term that's used for companies where they open up the core part of their company, but they might have different things on top of it that is like, part of their, like let's say intellectual property, or that's part of their business that it, or like the value generating part, and they don't open source that part, right? And so I want to get to a state where I can open source like 80-90% of everything that I'm building that is part of like in Athena Crisis, and then keep 10% that's, you know, where it's like, hey, if you want to play this game, you still do need to pay for it because that's the only way it makes sense for me, right? But if you want to like add things to the game, if you want to add features, if you want to change certain things, if you want to fix a bug, you know, or if you want to build a better AI than whatever I came up with, here's the code and you can do that and we can collaborate on that.
Wouldn't someone then also be able to just destroy the game or block something if they can add to it?
Yeah, so that's, I guess, part of those 10%. Like you wouldn't share access to like the server where the game is like hosted so people can go in, right? So you have to put some restrictions in place. If you give everything out there, you know, somebody will eventually come and like destroy it. So I'm working right now on like separating those pieces where it's like, you know, what is the maximum amount of stuff that I can open source that like anybody can like take and do whatever they want with it, compared to like what is the stuff that I need to keep internal.
And now, as you want to publish the game moving forward, you decided to go with a publisher not based in Japan. Was there a specific reason for not going with a in Japan-based company, or was it just like a coincidence because you both matched in terms of what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think, you know, this is maybe a reverse language barrier. Like I had no credentials in the gaming industry, and the publisher is a new publisher that's coming from the tech industry. Also, like the person who founded this publisher started the platform where all the open source projects in the world basically are hosted on. So there's like an obvious match there. And especially when I was saying, hey, I want to open source this, like it was like everybody's like, oh yeah, we get this. I think if you go with a traditional publisher, especially with a publisher in Japan, and you're like, hey, I'm going to give all of this code away for free and people can build their own version of the game, I don't think anybody would be very happy with that, because I think there's a lack of understanding of what that might mean.
So then there's an understanding and a use of open source technology in Japan, in the tech industry in general, but in the gaming industry, it's maybe more conservative and focused on, we need to have something that's unique to us so we can sell that and kind of build on this. And
yeah, absolutely. I think this is the interesting thing that I've been learning, and I think you were able to tease that out. That's great, is that the tech industry and the games industry are actually very different, and that's what I've been learning over the last year, right? And the tech industry, yes, there are companies that are focusing on the entertainment, but they're usually, there's this idea of aggregation theory. People can read up on that. But the idea is that you try to build a tech company that's as big as possible, that has as many people as possible coming to that platform, so that you kind of like have this maybe unlimited power where, you know, like everybody just comes to you, and, you know, they get advertisements from you, they get information, they get news from you, and the system's value increases with every user that you add to it, right? And the games industry is much more entertainment focused, of like, hey, we're building a product and we're going to give this product to you, right? And so if you're thinking that way, then it makes much more sense to be like, we don't want to give any part of our product away to somebody else because they could use it to make a better product.
Did you try, or did you have any interaction with Japanese publishers or the Japanese game industry, and when kind of introducing your projects, and kind of have some reactions to share or examples of what?
Not that many, mainly because I found the publisher when I wasn't, it was like a really, like, that's why I'm saying there was no real plan to it. Like I was like working on this game and I was like, this is kind of fun, what could I do with it? And then finding a publisher just kind of happened almost by accident. It was more like, hey, this is, you know, a cool thing, let's maybe talk. And so by the time I started publicly talking about this video game, I already had a publisher. And then I remember last year we went to like a games show in Tokyo where we were exhibiting the game. And the thing that felt really nice is there were a lot of Japanese publishers, and they all really liked the style of the game. They were like, wow, this is so cute, you know, like maybe if you're making another game, please sign with us. So I thought that what I was building was something that people here actually really like. So that felt good, but that's maybe the most of the interactions I had, just because it wasn't necessary for me to go into it and like explore that space.
So now let's talk about Athena Crisis a little bit more. You shared with us a little bit how you're building it and kind of the foundation. Well, what is the game type? What is unique about it, and when can we expect it?
Yeah. When I started working on it, I set out to build something that I could build on my own. And so if you're building a video game, there's just so much that goes into it. And if you're building a modern 3D game, the complexity is like just 10x or 100x more than building a 2D kind of like old school kind of game. And so just from a pragmatic perspective, it made much more sense to work on a 2D game that like looks more like an older game, like with pixel art, like things that were popular like 20, 30 years ago. But then my thought was, I want to bring that to like the modern level of like, what is like the best version of a game from 20 years ago that I can build today, that then a lot of people that are young today have never seen before because it's a different generation, right? And that way I thought I can limit the scope of this game to something that I can actually approach, and where you don't get drowned in like, okay, how do you even put something in a 3D context? And like, especially with this, you know, and this is also when we talked about like what changed when starting a company, like I put this really silly constraint on myself that I was only allowed to use open source projects or like third-party projects that I understood well enough to be able to recreate my own version of it. And so basically I disallowed myself from using a game engine because I never built one and I never really understood how they worked before. But that was my goal of like learning how to build like a game engine, right? So that's like just this silly constraint I put on myself. And so with all of that together, it just made sense to build what I call a modern retro game. So it's like a modern game, but it looks like a retro game from like 20, 30 years ago. And the actual game is, it's a tactical turn-based strategy game. And so it's, in its most simple explanation, it's kind of like chess.
Okay.
But on top of that, you have like really beautiful environments. You have like individual characters. There's like more than 50 characters in the game. And there's like different maps. On chess, you only have like the same 8x8 like kind of checkerboard, right? You have different maps, you have terrain, you have like mountains, forests, streets, and then you kind of build units and you try to beat your opponent. And instead of in chess, you get to move only one unit, one of each of your pieces at a time. In Athena Crisis, you get to move all of your units and then hand the turn off to somebody else. And then the modern part is where I think this is the interesting thing where I'm building this kind of video game that is like, it kind of looks like something from 20 years ago in a modern way. But then in terms of the technology stack, because I built it from the ground up and I imagined like, hey, I know how to build web applications. I know how to build websites. What if we built a game in the same way as like, you know, Facebook.com works or, you know, any other website works, right? Where it's like, it's always available. You can use it on any device. Whatever you put into it is like shared across all your devices. Like if you're right now playing a video game, like let's say on your Nintendo Switch and you're playing Fortnite, which is really popular, you have like your account there and maybe that's shared. But for most games nowadays, you play it on one device and everything is local to that device, and then you go somewhere else and then you have to start a new game or something like that. And for Athena Crisis, everything is always shared with everyone. And then on top of that, all of the entire game world is shared with all the other people as well. So you can build your own maps, but you can also build maps together with a friend and then share it with other people. You can play against the AI, but you can also play against another person. You can play together with an AI against another person. And so there's this single player campaign where you're just playing against the AI, but there's this feature in the game where another player can invade your single player game. And so it's a bit like a modern game like Elden Ring. I don't know if you've ever played that.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, and so there's like this whole thing where it's this game you expect to be completely single player, but then suddenly somebody else jumps in and like, you know, tries to help you or like tries to beat you or something like that. And then finally the last part is that because it's all web-based, I actually just put the whole game on the website. So you can go to athenacrisis.com, which is like the landing page. And like on every landing page for a video game, all you have, here's a trailer for our game. And then you click a button and you watch a video. When you go on athenacrisis.com, you have the actual game running right there and it loads within like a second. And you know, that's something that is kind of like unheard of, right? And then the other thing then is that the game is also updated in real time. So as I said earlier, we just shipped to early access. So a bunch of streamers on Twitch and YouTube, they have been playing the game. And like, it's really amazing to see people play like something I've created for like 3 or 4 hours at a time. But then I was actually working on the game while they were playing. And I like made a change to the game and they were like playing and it's like, oh, you know, the game is updated, and I just press a button and the game is like completely new and updated. And you don't have to sit around, wait for 10 gigabytes or 100 gigabytes to download and like close it and restart, make a coffee, you know, all these sort of things. So I'm trying to make this game, but also trying to build the technology stack to show, hey, this is kind of how game development should work.
I feel like that's very kind of forward-thinking approach. Especially, we had some other game developers on the show. From what I've heard of the Japanese gaming industry, which is still quite conservative, and you shared that as well too, this is extremely forward-thinking. Some linking to your experience at the game show in Tokyo, where they were like, "Oh, we like the design," but is this something they're into? Is this something that you think Japanese developers could be like, "Oh, this could be a new way for us to make games too here," because Japan is big in the video game industry.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so, right? That's like kind of the bet that I'm making, that is like the future path for game development. My problem is also that all these game engines are just so complex that you have like 1,000 people working on a game. Nobody really understands what any one thing is doing. And then those games are so huge. Everything is so slow while you're developing it. And then you ship it and it's like this 100 gigabyte download that takes like forever to download. And then it's full of bugs. And it like, there's like all these things. And so obviously what I'm building is nowhere close to the experiences you can build with those game engines. So, maybe only the ideas survive. And I think that's fine too. That's a fine outcome if like at the end of, at some point, if like Nakazawa Tech gets shut down, for example, like the thing that I want to call out here is like, this is not guaranteed to be a success, right? I'm trying something, it's like a risk. And the outcome with the company failing, that's an okay outcome. What I really care about is if like I can build something and prove to everyone, hey, this might be a better way to do things, and maybe inspire other people to take those ideas and make something better, right? Like that's an okay outcome for me. I just care about pushing things forward, right?
So looking back on your 4 years coming here at the beginning of COVID and starting the company and now really launching it, I mean, early access is available. Would you say Japan is a good place to start these kind of projects, to get into opening a company, specifically maybe tech and game development, as opposed to maybe your experience that you've had in London or California with like maybe Silicon Valley is known for being the very fast-paced tech.
I think it depends on who listens to this podcast, right? It's like, it would be nice to sit here and say, oh yeah, no, it's the best place to be, and like just go and do it, and like anything is possible. But to be honest, maybe given the story, like what people heard until now, I was like pretty lucky with a bunch of things that happened in my career where I was able, to find a publisher in the US where it's like much easier for me to work with. And I would like to think that Japan is a great place to do all that. But there are barriers, right? And like, it's not easy, right? And like for a lot of people, it might be, oh, I want to be a game developer in Japan. And like, they don't know what the reality of that is like. And I don't think anyone should use the experience I'm having now as like an example of like, this is what it will be like if you become a game developer, right? Especially if you don't have prior experience in the tech world or in the games industry. So it's hard to say. I don't think there's any way in which Japan would be better to do this than anywhere else. And this is maybe a whole different topic where, for me, since I was a teenager, I was working on my computer, right? And there's this whole discussion about remote work and should we go back to the office, or, should we hire people in Japan or in the US or in London? And for me, none of that makes sense. Like, I don't think the word remote work makes any sense, because where is remote, right? The thing is that all of us that work in an office job on a computer, we all work on the internet, and it shouldn't matter where you are, right? And so I don't consider myself as working in Japan necessarily. Like, I live in Japan. I love being in Japan. I would love for Japan to, in the games industry to like maybe adopt some of these methodologies, right? That would all be great. But for me personally, I work on the internet and I live in Japan. And I wish that was something that people could finally get their head around, because I think that's the future, right? It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter when you work, right? What matters is that you collaborate with people all around the world. One thing I haven't mentioned, like I'm talking about Athena Crisis is this thing that I'm building, but at this point, more than 30 people have actually worked on Athena Crisis, and very few of them are actually based in Japan. Very few of them I actually know what they look like. Even fewer of them I've met, right? So I worked with people on the internet to build a video game that's on a computer, and so it shouldn't matter where I am. So my wish here, if we're focusing specifically about Japan, is that it would be good if all these barriers were reduced, so it's easier to start things, right? And so now going back into like building a startup, right? I didn't take like VC funding, like, you know, you think of like when you think of like California and Silicon Valley, where, you know, you go somewhere and then a VC just like throws a bag of money at you and you click a button on a website and you have your company and everything is figured out, right? That is all very hard in Japan. And I think it's slowly changing, but it's maybe too slow. And so I think getting rid of the real world barriers so people can work more easily on the internet, I think that's the key thing to do.
If among our listeners now someone has been like you dreaming of maybe developing a game and starting their own project and maybe specifically doing this in Japan, is there any kind of advice you'd like to share or something that they should know before getting started that would maybe save them some trouble?
Yeah, I think the problem that I run into most of the time when people ask a question like this and then experienced people come, and the first thing that I notice always is there's like all these people that are trying to be gatekeepers, where the, like, you know, people are like, hey, I want to build a video game, how do I do it? And then people are like, oh, you know, it's a lot of work, and like maybe pick this programming language, not this other one, and like only this is the right way to do it or something. And, you know, the way I look at this is that if you want to build something, just figure out how to build that one thing. Don't worry about fundamentals of, you know, programming or computer science, or there's like all this, like, you know, how to make things fast or good or whatever. If you want to build a video game, just figure out how to build that video game that you want to build. And through that process, you'll learn how to actually build it. And don't let anyone like tell you that you cannot do it. You know, just go online, type into ChatGPT, how do I build a video game? I want to build this video game. Just go and do it. You know, I think this is like, we haven't really talked about AI and how that might influence like the future in this space, right? But I'm talking about how people are like gatekeepers. I experience it like even on like, so we have like this Discord server, this chat where people talk about Athena Crisis. And because I want to be open about how I'm building it, there's like a tech channel where people can ask questions, and I'm like, hey, you know, here's the code for the AI or whatever. And then somebody was like, hey, it was exactly this question, I want to build a video game. And then somebody else jumps in, it's like, oh, use this language. And like, it just, to me, it's like, this is exhausting. You know, I just told that person, just go and build it, right? And so ChatGPT is like this really great AI that's like always going to be there and supportive to you, you know, like it's not going to tell you cannot do it, right? And so maybe my real advice here is like, yeah, go use like ChatGPT or something and like ask it, hey, how do I build it? You know, because that will be your biggest supporter. Unless you have an actual person sitting next to you that's like, I'm going to teach you this and I'm going to give you my unlimited attention. Ask ChatGPT, hey, how do I build this? And then just figure out how to build that. And once you have it, you know, just figure out how to make it better and make it into something that other people like too.
Maybe as a last segment now, since you brought up the topic of AI, is this something you're integrating into the development of your game and tools like ChatGPT as a natural kind of progression of technology? Absolutely,
yeah. This is, it's been absolutely insane. Like there's people out there that are not using AI to do programming now, and I'm like, what? Why? Like, what are you doing, right? So I think if any developers are, you know, listening to this, you know, and you are not using what's called GitHub Copilot, which is like the ChatGPT for like coding, or not using ChatGPT, like, you know, stop what you're doing, spend the next 3 hours just figuring that out, set it up, pay those $10 or $20 a month. It's like, it's gonna pay so much dividends. You're gonna do your job twice as fast or whatever, and then just chill somewhere or something like that. So you know, like whatever the low cost for these systems is, it's gonna give you so much value. And so concretely, what that meant for me, like because I was like this single developer, and I was trying to understand all these things that I didn't know before, that I had never done before, I never had any faster way to get solutions to the questions that I had. You know, like usually I would like ask people that, you know, people are slow, they're not reliable. The thing is that people, if you know that they know the answer will always be correct. So with AI systems right now, like quite often they can be pretty wrong. So if you don't know what you're doing or what they are trying to do, then that can be problematic and you might go the wrong path. But then, you know, the other thing is you can Google things, but I'm not even using Google anymore. I just go to ChatGPT when I have questions about coding, for example. And so, yeah, I'm still thinking about the credit screen in the video game itself. I haven't put it in yet, but there's like, you know, people are making all the art, like all the music, all the pixel art, all the sounds, all completely handwritten or like hand drawn or, you know, hand composed by people. But in terms of programming, I'm the only programmer. And I've been wondering, should I put like GitHub Copilot and ChatGPT as like the other programmers on this project? because, none of them went off on their own to like build a feature, but, they have helped me build substantial portions of like things. I would write most of it, but then there's like small little bits where I wasn't sure, and I would use ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot to figure out how to do it.
It's quite interesting on two aspects, because so you said usually you'd go ask people and you don't know if you can trust them and such. When ChatGPT really became big a little over a year ago, in Japan, suddenly you'd go to a bookshop and you'd see shelves stacked with books about ChatGPT.
Really?
And my first thought was, if someone is actually interested in ChatGPT, wouldn't they just open it and like use it and just try it and maybe read about it online, not buy a book? So that was one curious thing that I noticed in Japan. And for the other one, I'm wondering, because I just saw a report online that said a study was done and they tested basically people's efficiency when using ChatGPT. And the finding was, for someone who doesn't know what they're doing, ChatGPT will actually slow them down and produce more mediocre work because they don't know about the topic that they're working with, and ChatGPT, they can't kind of verify. For someone who's very knowledgeable about a topic and just needs like a co-pilot, it will actually speed up their work and kind of increase output and be a useful tool. Is this how you see it as well?
Yeah, this is why the Copilot branding by Microsoft is just genius, because that is exactly what it is right now. It's like not fully autonomous. And if you're not an expert, then yeah, you can like totally mess things up. Like I had this thing where, so I'm using it for coding, but I never use it to write more than like half a line of code. Like you can ask it, hey, go and implement this algorithm, and like 9 times out of 10, it's not what I needed and it's wrong. So, but if you don't know that, if you don't have the experience as an engineer to know that what it outputs is wrong, you'll just put it in and then you'll have issues, right? And you have bugs and it doesn't work. And so, yes, I do have the experience that I'm able to tell this is exactly what I want. So please help me write it so I don't have to do the typing part, right? So I like to think that I use it more as like, this is intelligent autocomplete, right? And so I'm like, oh, I just cannot reach for this thing, or I don't know how to do this one thing. And then it gives me like 3 answers. And I'm like, okay, this, the third answer is the correct one out of those 3. The other 2 are like totally wrong. And so I think what I said earlier is like, if you want to get started programming, to use ChatGPT to get started, I think that's going to be an amazing way to get started, together with maybe like some tutorial or like a course, like a video course, or however you like to consume information, where you have like authoritative content. But then the nice thing about ChatGPT is that it's just, you can keep asking it questions, right? Where it's like, hey, this presenter explained how this thing works in programming. I don't understand it. Can you explain it to me? And then it will take that and like make it simpler so that you can actually understand it. And it's very rare that it makes mistakes like that. And yes, if you use it and you're not an expert in the field, it's kind of risky. And so I totally agree with you on that.
Moving forward with Nakazawa Tech, what are your next steps? You have the game released in early access, so I imagine you have an idea of when you want to have the final version out, probably. But
yeah, the final version is going to launch in the first 2 weeks of May. So it's only 2 months. Like there's a lot of video games that are in early access for like a year or 2, or they never get released. And one part of like building the game, that the way I built it, is that I can ship new features and changes incredibly fast. And so one thing that I actually do to get people more excited about the game is, I mentioned this Discord server. So Discord is like this chat system for people who don't know. And so there's people in there, and when they buy the game and they're really interested, they'll join that server. And also because it's early access, early access means that it's not finished yet, but it's still like good enough to play. And the game is actually already incredibly polished because I gave it to like a few hundred people already a few months ago before early access, and they gave a lot of incredible feedback. But then when a new person comes in, it's like, hey, I love this game, but here's the thing that could be better, or like, here's the thing that I didn't understand. And if I'm online, if I'm working right now, then I'll go in, prioritize whatever they just asked me for, if it's a good idea, and I will immediately implement it and try to ship it. And like it takes, let's say it's a small change, it might only take 10 minutes. But then the cool thing is, once I'm done with that change, it only takes 4 minutes for me to ship it to every single person that's playing the game right now. And it immediately updates. And so I've had this experience like at least 5 times now, where somebody new comes, has a piece of feedback. It's fairly easy for me to implement. It's not like a major feature that would take maybe a day or 2. It just takes like 10 minutes to half an hour. I implement it, I ship it, and then I'm like, hey, I just shipped this thing. And people are like, how is that possible? Like that's something that people in video games are like not used to. And so this is like a good way to get people even more excited. So I'm just trying to figure out how can I get even faster? How can I build things even faster? How can I ship faster? And then, as I said earlier, the next step is to open source it. And honestly, I have absolutely no plans past May because nothing else matters. I just need to ship it and then we'll see what happens.
It's been like the focus for the last 2 years.
Yeah, basically.
I think this episode we're recording today, early March, will actually be released shortly before launch.
Oh, that's exciting.
So timing is good here. I'm also looking forward to it. We talked about a lot of topics, from you moving to Japan, setting up and establishing the company, open source development, and the game itself. Do you feel like there's a part of your experience that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share about Japan or about the company or the tech industry?
Yeah. The thing you asked early on, like what changes when you have a company, I was doing this project for fun, and my ambition was, hey, I want to learn how to build a game like this with modern technology, you know, after not having worked on like video games for like 15 years at that time. And so it was just, I'm doing this for fun. And then when I started a company, my ambition was like, I have to be pragmatic and I just want to ship this game. And obviously it's a very niche game. It's like a kind of retro game. And you know, like there's a certain group of people that really love playing this game. And what I realized is at some point I thought, okay, this is actually really good. Like it works well. The music is fantastic because of these artists that I was able to work with. The art looks really great. People love all that, right? Like I have streamers that are like sitting on the stream and they're like humming the soundtrack and like, oh my God, I love this soundtrack. And then the portrait shows out. It's like, I love this portrait, right? And that feels great, right? So I just want to make something that takes me back to that time when I was a kid playing these games and give that same feeling to people, that, you know, that nostalgia. At the same time also have new players that like can appreciate it for what it is. But then after I realized, hey, this is actually pretty good, my ambition also changed again, where I thought, if I open source this game and other people can take it, make it better, build their own version of it, then my ambition should be to build the best game in this genre, in this niche that has ever existed. And that is open source, that is going to outlive everything. I really care about preservation. You know, a lot of games that are like 10 years old, you cannot play them anymore because the servers are down or whatever, because like they shut it down, didn't have enough players. So I want to open source it as a way to preserve it and to build this like really inclusive community of people that really care about this type of game, to just keep it going forever and grow it to something that's much bigger.
I can really feel your passion. I think I'm looking forward to actually seeing the release and seeing people enjoying it. And hopefully what you're trying to build will be there. And maybe if we meet again in 10, 15, 20 years, we can still be playing a different version of Athena Crisis, maybe.
That would be amazing.
New one. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you for coming and sharing your story. I think it was very, very interesting for me, and I hope it was the same for our listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.